Close your eyes. Imagine a market, an ancient Greek market, the Agora of Athens, the beating heart of the most intellectually vibrant city in the ancient world. The smell of fish and olive oil and fresh bread, the sound of merchants calling their wares, of philosophers arguing in the colonnades, of ordinary Athenians going about the business of their morning. And in the middle of it all, a man. He is carrying a lamp, a lit lamp, in broad daylight, walking through the crowded market with the lamp held up, peering into the faces of everyone he passes. Someone asks him what he is doing. He looks at them. "I am looking for an honest man," he says, and keeps walking. This is Diogenes of Sinope. He was born around 412 BC and died around 323 BC, coincidentally the same year as Alexander the Great, whose empire he outlived by a matter of months. He spent much of his life in Athens and Corinth. He lived in a large ceramic storage jar. He owned nothing. He wanted nothing. He was, by his own account, the happiest man in the world. He was also the most infuriating philosopher who ever lived. He argued with Plato. He mocked Alexander the Great to his face when Alexander was at the height of his power, surrounded by his army. He walked through Athens doing things that respectable Greeks considered deeply inappropriate, specifically to make the point that the respectability of respectable Greeks was entirely arbitrary. He had a philosophy, a genuine, serious, carefully worked out philosophy the school called Cynicism, from the Greek word for dog, which was what his contemporaries called him and which he embraced without embarrassment. The Cynics believed that human happiness depended not on wealth or status or the approval of others, but on virtue alone, on living according to nature, on stripping away everything that society had layered on top of the simple fact of being human, and finding out what was left. What Diogenes found was that what was left was rather good. Tonight we tell his story, 4 acts, 4 scenes in the life of the strangest, funniest, wisest man of the ancient world. So settle in, let the lamp burn, let the ancient market come to life around you, and let Diogenes carry you gently to sleep. Exile and the barrel, Sinope, Sinope, a prosperous Greek city on the southern coast of the Black Sea, in what is now the country of Turkey, on a peninsula of land that juts into the dark water. In the 4th century BC, it was a significant trading port, connected by sea routes to the Greek world and to the cultures of Asia and the Middle East. Diogenes was born here around 412 BC. His father was Hicesias, a banker, or more precisely, a money changer, someone who managed the city's currency and the exchange of coins from different places. It was a respectable profession, a useful profession, a profession that put the family in a position of some civic trust. And then they abused that trust. The ancient sources describe the scandal in different ways. Some say Hicesias debased the city's currency, shaved or altered the coins to make a profit at the city's expense. Some say Diogenes himself was involved. Some say Diogenes was merely an accomplice. Some say he was the instigator. What they all agree on is the outcome. Father and son were convicted of defacing the currency. They were exiled from Sinope. They lost everything, their position in the city, their property, their social standing, the respectable life that the family of a city banker enjoyed in a prosperous Greek port. Diogenes was sent out into the world with nothing. Now here is the moment that separates Diogenes from every other man who has ever been ruined and exiled. Most people would have experienced this as a catastrophe, Most people would have spent the rest of their lives trying to rebuild what had been lost, seeking to restore their position, to regain their wealth, to find their way back to respectability. Diogenes looked at what had happened and decided that losing everything was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Not because he was making the best of a bad situation, not as a coping mechanism, but because he genuinely concluded, through a process of careful philosophical reasoning, that everything he had lost was not worth having in the first place. The money, the position, the social standing, the approval of the respectable citizens of Sinope. All of it, he decided, was noise, artificial, imposed by convention rather than by nature. He had been, without knowing it, liberated. He walked toward Athens, arriving in Athens. Athens in the 4th century BC was the intellectual capital of the known world. Plato was teaching there, running the academy, the school of philosophy he had founded, attracting students from across the Mediterranean. Aristotle was studying at the academy. Socrates had died not long before, executed for impiety and corrupting the youth, his memory still vivid and his example still controversial. Into this city of extraordinary intellectual ferment, Diogenes arrived. He had nothing, no money, no contacts, no letter of introduction, no social position. He went to the Athenian marketplace, the Agora, and asked around about Antisthenes, a philosopher who had been a student of Socrates and who was developing a school of thought that emphasized virtue over wealth, simplicity over sophistication. Antisthenes told him to go away. Diogenes did not go away. Antisthenes threatened to beat him with his staff if he did not leave. Diogenes looked at the staff. "Go ahead," he said. "You will find no wood hard enough to drive me away as long as you keep speaking." Antisthenes reportedly kept speaking. What Antisthenes was teaching, what would eventually develop into the Cynic school of philosophy, was exactly what Diogenes needed. Or rather, it was a more formal version of the conclusion he had already reached by being exiled and losing everything. The core of the Cynic argument was this: human beings, like all animals, have a nature. They have natural needs: food, warmth, shelter, companionship. These needs can be met simply and without great difficulty. But human society has layered an enormous amount of additional desire on top of these natural needs. The desire for wealth beyond what is necessary, for status, for the approval of others, for luxury, for entertainment, for all the 1,001 things that Greek social life told people they needed in order to be respectable, successful, admired members of their community. These additional desires, the Cynics argued, were the source of human misery. Not nature. Nature was easy to satisfy. It was the artificial demands of convention that made people unhappy, anxious, competitive, and cruel. The solution was simple in theory and extremely difficult in practice. Shed the artificial, return to the natural, stop wanting what convention said you should want and start living according to what you actually needed. Diogenes decided to take this argument to its logical extreme. The jar. He needed somewhere to sleep. Athens had no shortage of shelters for the poor: temple porticos, market colonnades, various public spaces where people without means could spend the night. Diogenes used these for a time. And then he found his permanent home, a large ceramic pithos. The pithos was a storage jar, the kind used to store grain or olive oil or wine. Large ones were genuinely large, big enough to hold a man, big enough to provide a kind of shelter from the elements. They were common in Athens, used and discarded, not considered valuable. Diogenes moved into one. He dragged it to the edge of the agora and made it his home. He slept in it. He kept his few possessions in it. He received visitors at it. He conducted philosophical conversations from the entrance of his jar with the same authority that Plato conducted seminars in the polished halls of the academy. The gesture was deliberate, and its meaning was precise. The jar was the minimum, the absolute baseline of shelter. If human beings needed shelter, and they did, this was a genuine natural need, then the jar satisfied that need. Everything beyond the jar, the house, the decorated rooms, the servants, the furniture, the possessions that filled the houses of wealthy Athenians was surplus, convention, noise. He was demonstrating his philosophy, not merely describing it. He also famously acquired a drinking bowl at some point and then threw it away when he saw a child drinking from its cupped hands. If a child needs no bowl, he said, neither do I. The bowl was an affectation, the hands were sufficient, away went the bowl. He watched the stray dogs of Athens with genuine admiration. The dogs ate whatever they found, they slept wherever they could, they were neither embarrassed nor proud. They simply were what they were and did what they needed to do without reference to what anyone else thought about it. He called himself and his followers cynics, from the Greek word kion, meaning dog. They were the dog philosophers, the ones who lived like animals and meant it as a compliment. The people of Athens, to their credit, tolerated him. More than tolerated, they were fascinated. They came to talk to him. They brought him food sometimes, which he accepted without embarrassment. They laughed at his jokes, which were numerous and extremely pointed. He was happy, or at least he said he was happy, and the evidence of his life suggests he was not lying. He had nothing, he needed nothing, he wanted nothing beyond what he had. And from the entrance of his jar, he watched the richest and most powerful people in the world rushing around trying to accumulate more of the things he had already decided were worthless. He found it, one suspect, quite funny. Trolling the elite. Plato. If Diogenes had a nemesis, or perhaps more accurately, a favorite target, it was Plato. Plato was everything Diogenes found philosophically irritating. He was wealthy and well-born. He dressed elegantly. He ran a prestigious school with formal procedures and institutional gravity. He believed in abstract philosophical ideals, the forms, the realm of perfect non-material essences of which all earthly things were merely imperfect copies. He was, in Diogenes's view, exactly the kind of philosopher who had gotten so far from concrete reality in the pursuit of abstract theory that he had forgotten what actual human life was like. Their rivalry was legendary. Plato called Diogenes Socrates gone mad. Diogenes, for his part, described Plato as a man who wasted time talking about things that did not exist in order to avoid dealing with things that did. The most famous story of their encounters involves a definition. Plato at the Academy had offered a definition of a human being. A human being is a featherless biped. It was a reasonable attempt at a definition by the methods of the time. You define a thing by identifying what it belongs to, animals in this case, and then what distinguishes it from other members of that category. Humans are animals. They walk on two legs. They lack feathers. Featherless biped. Diogenes went away. He came back the next day with a plucked chicken. He walked into the academy, held up the chicken and announced, "Behold, I have brought you Plato's man." The academy was amused. Plato was not amused, or at least he was forced to revise his definition. adding broad flat nails as an additional distinguishing characteristic. But the point had been made. A definition so easily demolished by a plucked chicken was not a very good definition, and a philosopher so concerned with the elegance of his theoretical framework that his definition of a human being could not withstand a chicken was perhaps not the most reliable guide to reality. There was another famous exchange. Plato, in the course of a discussion, described what he considered the most admirable kind of table, a table defined by its tableness, by the form of the table of which all actual tables were imperfect copies. Diogenes looked at a table in the room. "I see a table," he said. "I don't see any tableness." Plato replied, "That is because you have eyes but no intelligence." Diogenes considered this. "That may be," he said, "but the person who lacks intelligence sees a table. The person who has intelligence but loses contact with reality sees tableness. Which of us is better served?" The rivalry between Diogenes and Plato was not merely personal antagonism. It represented a genuine and deep philosophical disagreement about where wisdom was to be found, in the abstract realm of theory, or in the concrete reality of everyday life. Diogenes never doubted which side of that argument he was on. Alexander the Great. And then there was Alexander. In 336 BC, Alexander the Great became king of Macedonia. He was 20 years old, already famous, already dangerous. Within a few years, he would begin the campaign that would carry him from Greece to India and make him the most powerful man in the ancient world. Before he left Greece, he went to Corinth. In Corinth, all the great men of Greece came to pay their respects to the new king. Philosophers, politicians, generals, aristocrats, everyone who mattered in the Greek world came to be seen in Alexander's presence, to curry favor, to position themselves advantageously for whatever came next. Everyone except Diogenes. Diogenes was in Corinth at the time. He was living, as usual, with radical simplicity, in his jar or near it, doing what he did, ignoring the political upheavals that exercised everyone else. Alexander heard about this. He was intrigued. He went to find Diogenes. He found him lying in the sunshine, resting, enjoying the warmth of the day. Alexander stood before him with his retinue, the most powerful man in the world, with the army that would eventually conquer Persia and Egypt and Bactria and India, looking down at an old man lying in the sun in a ceramic jar. "I am Alexander the Great," he said. Diogenes looked up at him. "And I am Diogenes the dog," he said. Alexander asked if there was anything he could do for Diogenes, any gift he could offer, any wish he could grant. This was the offer that no sane person refused from Alexander of Macedon. This was the offer that kings and governors and wealthy men accepted with gratitude and used to secure their futures. Diogenes looked at him for a moment. "Yes," he said, "stand out of my sunlight." The retinue was outraged. The guards moved forward. Alexander's advisors were horrified. Alexander stopped them. He looked at Diogenes for a long moment. Then he said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." He turned and walked away, leaving the old man to his sunshine. This story has been told for 2,500 years. It survives because it contains something that we recognize as true, something about the nature of freedom, about the limits of worldly power, about what it actually means to have everything. Alexander had an empire, he had armies, He had the wealth of Persia and the admiration of the world. Diogenes had his sunshine, and Diogenes was not impressed by Alexander's empire. Alexander, looking at Diogenes, understood that the old man in the jar had something he did not have, something that all the conquests in the world could not purchase. The complete indifference to what other people thought of him. Alexander envied it. He went back to his army and continued his conquest of the world. Diogenes went back to sleep. The lesser, encounters. Alexander was the most famous of Diogenes' encounters with the powerful, but he was not the only one. Diogenes had a gift for the perfectly timed, perfectly aimed remark that deflated pomposity without apparent effort. He collected these encounters the way other philosophers collected arguments. A man who was proud of his wealth once showed Diogenes his magnificent house and warned him not to spit on the floor. The floors were too beautiful to be defiled. Diogenes looked around the room carefully. Then he spat in the man's face. When asked why, he said, "It was the only dirty place I could find." A man showed off his extensive library, proudly displaying the thousands of scrolls he had accumulated, the mark of an educated, cultivated Athenian gentleman. Diogenes looked at the shelves. "You are building a fine tomb for yourself," he said. "To fill a house with books you never open and never apply is merely to preserve the appearance of learning without its substance." A young man came to him claiming to have studied philosophy and wanting to discuss virtue. Diogenes asked him what he had learned. The young man launched into a careful, formal recitation of philosophical propositions about virtue and the good life. Diogenes waited for him to finish. "Tell me," he said, "when do you plan to start?" These encounters, and there were many of them, were not merely clever, they were practical philosophy. The point of each exchange was to cut through the artificial, the pretentious, the conventional to the actual reality underneath. The man proud of his flaws was more concerned with his flaws than with human decency. The man proud of his library had confused the appearance of wisdom for its substance. The student who could define virtue without practicing it had missed the entire point. Diogenes made these observations not with cruelty but with a kind of cheerful precision. He was not trying to hurt people. He was trying to show them something quickly, directly, memorably, that they were unlikely to see on their own. He was, in his way, performing a service. Not everyone appreciated it, but enough people did that he became, over the decades, a fixture of Athenian and later Corinthian intellectual life. Not as a respected teacher in the formal sense, he would have despised that, but as a kind of living provocation, a human question mark wandering through the city, asking by his existence what all the ambition and wealth and status was actually for. The man with the lanterns. Scene 1, the lamp in the market. The lamp. This is perhaps the image most associated with Diogenes. The old man walking through the crowded Athenian market in broad daylight with a lit lamp in his hand, peering into the faces of the people he passed. "I am looking for an honest man." The gesture was theatrical. It was meant to be. Diogenes understood that philosophy conducted in lecture halls reached only the people who came to lecture halls. Philosophy conducted in the marketplace, where everyone was, where you could not avoid it, reached everyone. The lamp in daylight was a contradiction, obviously, pointlessly visible in the sunlight, making no practical contribution to anyone's ability to see. It was absurd. It attracted attention, and once attention was attracted, the question could be asked, "Why do you carry a lamp in daylight?" "I am looking for an honest man." The implication hung in the air. The market was full of people, and not one of them, Diogenes was suggesting, was obviously and straightforwardly honest, so honestly that a seeker of honesty could identify them from across the market without a lamp. It was funny, it was pointed, it was the kind of provocation that people remembered and repeated, and in repeating spread the question it contained. Where are the honest men? The question is not merely rhetorical. Diogenes had a specific answer. The honest man is not hard to find, but finding him requires clarity about what honesty actually means, and most people, living as they do in the midst of social conventions and expected behaviors and comfortable fictions, have lost that clarity. The lamp was a prop for an argument about the difficulty of seeing clearly when you are surrounded by convention. Diogenes used props frequently. He understood what we might now call the power of performance, that a philosophical point made through action had more impact than the same point made through words. Words could be argued with, qualified, reinterpreted. A plucked chicken thrown into a lecture hall could not. He was, in some ways, the first performance artist. The public, provocation. Eating in public. This sounds like a minor thing. In contemporary life, it is not merely acceptable but universal. Eating while walking, eating in public spaces, eating in view of strangers, none of this registers as remotely unusual. In ancient Athens, it was a significant social transgression. Greek culture in this period placed great emphasis on the distinction between public and private life. Eating was a private activity conducted in the home or at formal dinner parties with invited guests in controlled settings with appropriate ceremony. To eat in the agora in full public view without ceremony, without the social framework that eating was supposed to take place within, was to violate a convention that most Athenians took seriously. Diogenes ate in the agora. He sat in the market and consumed his simple food, whatever he had been given or found, in full public view, without embarrassment, without ceremony, without apology. When people objected, he said, "I was hungry in the market. It seemed reasonable to eat in the market. Hunger does not consult social convention about where it is permitted to occur." He was making a point about the arbitrary nature of social convention, about the way that human beings had taken perfectly natural activities and surrounded them with layers of ritual and expectation that served no natural purpose and existed only to distinguish people who could perform them correctly from people who could not. The man who knew how to eat in the right place, in the right way, with the right people, was respectable. The man who was merely hungry and ate when and where he was hungry was common. Diogenes thought this was backwards. He also slept wherever he happened to be when he was tired. He relieved himself wherever was convenient. He did, in short, whatever his nature required, wherever he happened to be, without reference to what the people around him thought was appropriate. Not because he was antisocial, but because he was making, continuously and systematically, the argument that the gap between what convention said was appropriate and what nature actually required was vast, and that everything in that gap was costing people their happiness without providing them with anything real in return. The philosopher Plato had a description of Diogenes that, for all its disapproval, captured the man perfectly. Socrates gone mad, he called him. What he meant was this: Socrates had also questioned convention. Socrates had also made people uncomfortable. Socrates had also prioritized the examined life over the comfortable one. But Socrates had done it through conversation, through the careful Socratic dialogue, through the polite asking of questions that led people gently toward uncomfortable conclusions. Diogenes had decided that this was too slow and too polite. He preferred the plucked chicken, the philosophy behind the provocations. Beneath the comedy, and there was genuine comedy, Diogenes was genuinely funny. There was a serious and carefully worked-out philosophy. The Cynics believed that human beings were suffering unnecessarily, not from natural causes, from hunger, from cold, from the ordinary difficulties of physical existence. These sufferings were real and should be minimized through practical wisdom. Diogenes was genuinely skilled at keeping himself warm, fed, and sheltered with minimal resources. The unnecessary suffering came from desire, from the gap between what people had and what they wanted, from the anxiety of social approval, the constant, exhausting performance of being the kind of person that one's community approved of. The Stoics, who came after the Cynics and drew heavily on their ideas, would formalize this into a complete philosophical system. The Stoics took from the Cynics the central insight that human happiness depended on what you desired, not on what you possessed, and built around it an elaborate account of virtue, reason, and the proper ordering of the passions. But Diogenes was not interested in elaborate accounts of anything. He was interested in demonstration. The jar was a demonstration. The lamp was a demonstration. The eating in the market was a demonstration. The plucked chicken was a demonstration. The interaction with Alexander was a demonstration. Each one showed something that 1,000 carefully reasoned philosophical propositions would have taken far longer to convey. You do not need what you think you need. The person who needs nothing from Alexander the Great is freer than Alexander the Great. The jar is enough, the sunshine is enough, hunger and the solution to hunger are enough. Everything else is noise. He lived this argument with a completeness and a consistency that was itself the most powerful philosophical argument he made. You could disagree with his reasoning. You could argue that some of the things he rejected as conventional were not merely conventional but genuinely valuable: friendship, beauty, learning, the pleasures of civilization. But you could not dismiss him as a hypocrite. He lived exactly what he preached. And that, in the long history of philosophy, is rather unusual. The slave, the pirate, and the legacy. The pirates, sometime in the middle of his life, the exact date is uncertain, Diogenes went on a sea voyage. The ancient sources do not specify where he was going or why. Perhaps he was traveling to visit someone. Perhaps he was simply moving from one place to another as he moved through his life without great attachment to destination. The ship was captured by pirates. Cilician pirates, the organized maritime criminals of the ancient Mediterranean, operating out of the rocky coastline of what is now southern Turkey, were a constant hazard for anyone traveling by sea in this period. They captured ships, took the passengers and crew, and sold them in the slave markets of the eastern Mediterranean. This is what happened to Diogenes. He was taken to the island of Crete and put up for sale in the slave market. The slave market was a spectacle of human misery. Men and women and children, frightened and humiliated, displayed for the assessment of buyers. Their skills and physical condition evaluated with the same clinical detachment one might apply to livestock. Diogenes, according to the sources, conducted himself with complete equanimity. When the auctioneer asked him what skills he had, the standard question put to slaves being offered for sale, Diogenes did not mention any of the practical skills that typically commanded high prices in the ancient slave market. He did not claim to be a skilled craftsman or a literate secretary. He said, "I know how to govern men." The auctioneer repeated this to the crowd. "Point me," Diogenes added, "to someone who needs a master." It is impossible to verify the precise words, but the attitude they capture is entirely consistent with everything else we know about Diogenes. Even in the slave market, even being sold as property, he maintained the fundamental Cynic position that his freedom was internal and could not be taken from him by external circumstances. He had spent his whole life demonstrating that freedom was not a matter of external conditions, but of internal orientation. The man without a home, without possessions, without social standing was freer than the king, if the king needed things that Diogenes did not. Being sold into slavery was simply the most extreme test of this proposition. He passed it. Exile and Corinth. The man who bought Diogenes was named Xeniades. He was a wealthy Corinthian, a man of property and social standing, exactly the kind of person that Diogenes had spent his life subjecting to philosophical provocation. He bought Diogenes not for any practical skill. Governing men was not a service that most slave owners required, but apparently out of fascination. He had heard of Diogenes. He wanted to see what the famous philosopher was like up close. What he got was rather more than he bargained for. Diogenes ran the household. This is not a metaphor. He actually managed Xeniades' domestic affairs, overseeing the slaves, organizing the running of the house, making decisions about the management of the property. He did this with the same practical intelligence he brought to everything. He was, it turned out, an effective household manager. He also became the tutor to Xeniades' sons. And here, Diogenes found something that he was apparently genuinely good at and genuinely enjoyed: teaching children. His approach to education was entirely consistent with his philosophy. He taught the boys to ride, to throw javelins, to fight with their fists. He taught them to serve their own food, to look after their own things, to be comfortable in physical discomfort. He taught them not to want more than they needed. He taught them, in short, to be cynics. Xeniades' sons, by the accounts that survive, turned out exceptionally well, self-reliant, capable, morally serious, without being sanctimonious. Xeniades himself was apparently so impressed by what Diogenes had done with his children that he declared Diogenes not a slave but a god. This is obviously an exaggeration, but it captures something about the relationship that developed between the wealthy Corinthian and the philosopher he had bought. Diogenes had been captured by pirates, sold at auction, and ended up in a comfortable household in Corinth, where he ran the domestic affairs and educated the children. He remained there for the rest of his long life. He was, by all accounts, content. Not because he had been restored to comfort and security, those things meant nothing to him, but because Corinth turned out to be a perfectly good place to continue being Diogenes. The people of Corinth visited him as the people of Athens had. They came with their questions and their problems and their pretensions. He addressed them with his characteristic directness. He continued to sleep simply, ate simply, neighed simply. He continued to find the spectacle of ambitious, anxious, wealth-seeking humanity gently, perpetually amusing. The death of the dog philosopher. Diogenes died around 323 BC, the same year almost to the month as Alexander the Great, who died in Babylon at 32, having conquered most of the known world. Diogenes died in Corinth in his old age. The exact age is uncertain, but he was probably in his 80s or 90s, which made him extraordinarily long-lived by the standards of the ancient world and rather supportive of his argument that the simple life was good for you. The ancient sources offer several different accounts of how he died, which suggests that no one was entirely sure. Some say he died from eating a raw octopus, a food poisoning incident that, if true, is the most Diogenes death imaginable. Some say he died of a dog bite that became infected. Some say he simply ceased to breathe, having decided he had no further use for breathing. All of these are probably somewhat legendary. What we can say is that he died, and that by most accounts he died as he had lived, without fuss, without anxiety, without apparent regret. Before he died, he gave instructions about what should be done with his body. He said it should be thrown over the city walls. When asked why, he said that he wanted the animals to be able to get to it. His companions were horrified. They said they would have no means of driving the animals away. "Give me a stick to drive them away with," then said Diogenes. "But you will be dead. You won't be able to use a stick." "In that case," said Diogenes, "what does it matter that the animals get to me?" He was to the last making the argument, the body after death is not you. The dignity of the corpse is a convention. The dead do not care what happens to their remains. He was buried in Corinth. In the end, his companions apparently unable to bring themselves to follow his instructions quite that literally. A marble pillar was erected over his grave, surmounted by a dog carved in Parian marble. The dog philosopher, the cynic, the man who lived in a jar. The lantern still burning. And so the story of Diogenes comes to rest. 80-odd years, from the banker's son in Sinope who was exiled for defacing the currency, to the old man in Corinth who ran a wealthy household and educated its children and died, having given more serious thought to how to live than almost any person who has ever breathed. He lived in a jar. He threw a plucked chicken at Plato. He told Alexander the Great to get out of his sunlight. He walked through the market looking for an honest man. He was sold into slavery and made himself indispensable to his owner within weeks. He owned nothing, he needed nothing. He wanted nothing except the sunshine and the simple food and the conversations and the observations that kept flowing from an extraordinary mind engaged with an ordinary world. Was he right? The pure cynic position that everything beyond the barest necessities is artificial and should be shed is probably too extreme for most people to follow, and Diogenes himself seems to have been unusual in the degree to which he found it genuinely sufficient. But the question he kept asking, what is this actually for? What do I actually need? What is convention and what is nature? Is one that never loses its power. Every generation inherits a set of things that it is supposed to want. The house, the status, the approval, the accumulation. Every generation benefits from someone who walks through the market with a lamp asking what all of it is actually for. Diogenes was that person for ancient Athens. He is still that person if you let him be. Let those images settle now, like dust in old sunlight. The young man walking out of Sinope with nothing, the jar in the agora, the plucked chicken sailing through the air of Plato's academy, the old man lying in the sunshine, utterly undisturbed by the most powerful man in the world, the lamp in the market, the honest man nowhere to be found, the slave market in Crete, and a man who could not be made a slave, the Corinthian household, running smoothly under the management of a philosopher who had decided that governance was what he was good at. Let the lamp go out. It has found what it was looking for, or decided that what it was looking for was never there to be found, which amounts in Diogenes' philosophy to the same thing. And sleep, a soft, deep, dreamless sleep. Good night.